Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to 19 Washington Square North, which is what we think of as the intellectual center and home of NYU Abu Dhabi here in New York. My name is Michael Puruganan. I'm a Silver Professor of Biology here at NYU, and I also run a laboratory at NYU Abu Dhabi, and I have the privilege of serving as the academic director of 19 Washington Square North. So it's a pleasure to welcome you to another academic year of exciting and stimulating programs here at 19. This is actually our first, we've had several events over the past few weeks, but this is our first formal event here at 19, so you're all kicking it off. So many of you may or may not know this, but over the academic year, 19 Washington Square North is host to numerous activities from lectures, conferences, exhibitions, and their openings. And it serves as a meeting place for students and faculty, and indeed members of the public, to interact and learn. A key partner of ours here at 19 is the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute in Abu Dhabi and New York, which has organized many of the activities that offers the Washington Square community opportunities to hear experts talk about their research and its societal relevance, technological and cultural impact, and importance for the world at large. Just to let you know, we have a full calendar this semester, so if you're interested in looking, you'll probably get little notices in the next few days for other events. Just to let you know, on Thursday at 9 in the morning, we'll have a breakfast panel discussion on climate with Seth Borenstein, who is the Associated Press environmental editor. I forget who the other person is that he's talking to, but there'll be two of them in a discussion. And in the afternoon of that same day, we have Shannon Dowdy, a famous anthropologist from the University of Chicago, to talk about what do you put in a doomsday vault, another thing we offer during Climate Week. But today we're very pleased to see all of you in this talk and conversation with Martín Bowen, Associate Professor of History at NYU Abu Dhabi, to talk about the subject of his book on the Age of Dissent. To introduce him in the panel, I would like to welcome Professor Sinclair Thomson, Associate Professor of History at NYU New York. He's the author of We Alone Will Rule, Native Andean Politics in the Age of Insurgency, and the co-author of the Bolivia Reader, History, Culture, and Politics. He will moderate today's discussion and introduce Professor Bowen and the rest of the panel.
Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. Thanks to the Abu Dhabi outfit here for hosting us, having us in all the work, putting it together. Thanks to all of you for coming out. I want to welcome everyone. And it's a great occasion to have Martín with us and to be able to do this book presentation. We have Martín as well as Kirsten Schultz, who will be here to provide a comment and on the book and a conversation with Martín. So I'm just going to introduce the two of them fairly briefly. Martín is Associate Professor of History at NYU Abu Dhabi. And we haven't had the pleasure of his company for a few years, but Martín was here for a full year between 2016 and 2017, which was a great time. We have very fond memories of his visit with Josefina. And I think that, since I first heard Martín speak and first began reading Martín, I've been learning constantly from him, and that has continued down to the present. He was speaking this morning. We had a great conversation in Atlantic History Workshop, and that bubbled over into more great conversation, having a bite to eat just before this. And so it's been an ongoing and really stimulating relationship with Martín. So it's wonderful pleasure to have him back. When he was here for a full year, we were able to do a lot. He's here now only for 1 week, so we're trying to exprimirle el jugo to take as full advantage as possible. So he was in the Atlantic History Workshop session this morning. We have the book presentation today. We have he's teaching my graduate seminar in the morning and really taking advantage of him. And Friday, he's going to be in the New York City Latin American History Workshop. He's going to be presenting the same paper that he presented this morning, which is on the conspiracy of the French in Santiago in 1780. And it's a fascinating story. He's done really, really provocative analysis of the case. And I think it's going to be a different conversation on Friday with the Latin Americanists compared to the Atlantic historians. So please come out for that on Friday if you haven't had a chance to read the paper or you're interested. This is a book presentation, but it's actually not the first book that Martín published. And I just wanted to mention his earlier book because some of you may not know of it, but it's a book that he published in 2014 called Experimentar el cuerpo y escribir los pecados, la confesión general de José Ignacio Izaguirre, 1799 a 1808. And this is a book that he published based on a very unusual archival document that he found. And he publishes the whole document and does an extended analysis of it. And it's a very strange and interesting document. It's hard to fit it into any kind of standard historiographic categories. It's not quite history of the body. It's not quite history of sexuality. It is, but it's also about the history of memory and childhood and communication technologies and intimacy, education. But he does a very original analysis of it and helps us to think about it in a way that also breaks with some of our standard ideas about the emergence of modern subjectivity. It doesn't quite fit those standard narratives either. So I encourage you to look for that as well if you're interested in these kinds of themes. And now we have the Age of Dissent, Revolution and the Power of Communication in Chile, 1780 to 1833. I see there are a few copies of the book if you want to scramble for them afterwards. And this is a much elaborated revision of his doctoral dissertation, which he wrote at the École des Hautes Études in Paris. I won't say more about the book because we have Kirsten Schultz here to tell us about the book and offer her thoughts. Kirsten is a professor of history at Seton Hall University. And speaking of dissertation projects, she did her own dissertation here at NYU some years ago. We're actually old friends and colleagues from those days. And so she has long NYU roots. And her dissertation was the basis for her first book, Tropical Versailles, Empire, Monarchy, and the Portuguese Royal Court in Rio de Janeiro, 1808 to 1821, which was published by Routledge. And that when it came out, the book was already like a go-to source on the topic of the transfer of the Portuguese Royal Court from Portugal to Brazil. But I think that in recent years with the bicentennial commemorations of Latin American independence, it's become already a classic. And one reader said about the book, it is a beautifully written and brilliantly argued study of one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of the Atlantic world. That was words of Barbara Weinstein. And we have other great news in terms of new book publications because Kirsten has just published another book very recently. It came out this year with Yale University Press. It's called From Conquest to Colony, Empire, Wealth, and Difference in 18th Century Brazil, which looks at the status of Brazil within the Portuguese Empire. And Jeremy Edelman said about this book, Kirsten Schultz's magnificent study of the Portuguese-Brazilian Empire's golden age explores the interconnection between wealth and race, imperial monarchy and colonial loyalty, and the shifting imaginations of reform and order across the turbulent 18th century. The research is impressive and the writing gilded. It must be read by all historians of the Atlantic world. So encourage you to get a copy of that for your reading list, as well as a copy of Martín's book. And I will now turn it over to Kirsten for her comment. And if you'd like to come up here, oh, sorry, we'll do it this way. Martín will start us off. He'll give us his own thoughts on the book. And then we'll go to Kirsten, and then she can give us her thoughts. And then the two of them can talk for a bit. And then we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A if those of you in the audience have some questions. Okay, all right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sinclair. All right. First of all, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming here today. Thanks, Michael, for your introduction. Thanks, and through you to all of the staff here at the Institute for hosting us, for setting up this event, and for organizing it in such short notice. I want to recognize all of the work that everyone here has been doing over the past few weeks to have this event, to make this event possible. And thanks to Sinclair for his generous introduction. Can you hear me well? I hear like a weird sound. Is that me or? No, it's not me. Is it? Oh, anyway. I am I'm not used to these book launch events. They are very different in different countries. So usually in my home country, in Chile, the author does not get a chance to speak. So only other people talk about their book, and then everyone claps, and that's the end of it. I will. So I'm not entirely sure what I'm supposed to do, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book, how I came to this particular topic, what the book is about. I'm going to share with you a little bit of the findings, let's say the content of the book, right? A little bit what each chapter is about, so you get a sense of like the meat of the argument. And then I will discuss with you what I think are the main contributions that I'm trying to make to the literature with this particular set of publication. All right, so this is a book about how women and men, ordinary women and men of all sort of walks of life and different sort of racial statuses and social positions, revolutionized politics between 1780 and 1833 in Chile. And why this process, by definition, was also a revolution in communication. So I try to show that those two sort of movements are actually one and the same. And the research for this book began almost 15 years ago while I was, or over 15 years ago now that I think of it, while I was studying my BA thesis. No, I was actually, yes, I was writing my BA thesis in Chile's Catholic University. And I was working on theater, theatricality, and public performances around this era in the early 19th century. And I was interested in the political role that theater, public ceremonies and other forms of performance had on the political process at the time. But as I read the scholarship and the sources from that time, I started realizing that there was a discrepancy between how the sources describe the power of these cultural artifacts, like theater or a public ceremony, and what scholars said about those same artifacts. So, for example, somebody could claim that, a scholar, a historian could claim that theater was a powerful instrument through which elites could instill on the population new ideas about Republican regimes or a new sense of national identity that was new because this was a moment of revolution, a moment of independence from Spain, right? For those of you who are unfamiliar with Chilean history, around the early 19th century, there was a series of civil wars that were part of the larger Spanish Imperial Civil War that led to the country's independence. So, and formation as an independent republic based on popular sovereignty and a sense of like national identity. So, so some scholars claim, all right, theater has a role on this. It has the power, theater has the power to shape people's minds. It transforms their emotions. It changes their experience. Or for example, about public performances, they said, a public ceremony changes people's perception of space and time. And so it makes them, it makes the audience sort of, it transforms the ways in which the audience think about politics or how they experience politics. And, but the sources didn't say that. They said something similar, but not exactly quite the same. When I read the sources up close, what they were saying, for example, is that theater is very powerful. It indeed transforms people, but it's just because it offers, or not just, but it's partly because it offers a model to be imitated. And so people imitate each other. So theater is very powerful because you can set up a series of models that people will then imitate. That's where the political efficacy of theater came from. And so I saw a discrepancy between what historians and scholars were saying about the power of these cultural artifacts and what the sources were saying. And I found myself in a position to be not neutral, but to be interested in this topic in what I think is an original way, because much of that scholarship at the time about public performances and theater and public ceremonies was aimed at proving that power. So in a certain way, the basic assumption from which most scholars worked was to prove that theater was important, that it had an effect on people, that public ceremonies were relevant, and that's why they deserved to be studied. So there was a relationship between the historiographical claims that each author was making and the power they attributed to these cultural artifacts. But I was not personally a theater person. I was not interested in theater per se. I was just interested in this broader political questions. And so I found I was more skeptical. I do not know if theater has that power. And that's more or less the position that I adopt in this book. So as I will explain to you a little bit in more detail later, when I talk about the power of communication in this book, in the title, it's more of a question. It's not an assertion. I don't know what the power of communication is. What I'm interested in is how a series of actors lay claims about why communication is powerful, what it does, how they affect each other, their ability to transform social life and to transform other people's, experience of the world through some communicative practices. And so I saw this discrepancy and I said, all right, here's something that deserves additional exploration. And so I decided to work on that for my PhD, for my doctoral sort of dissertation. And I said, all right, I'm going to extend this from theater to all the cultural forms or artifacts that seem to be relevant at the time to shape people's minds. So I'm going to talk about music. That was my original project. You'll see that the book is different. But I said, I'm going to talk about music and perhaps gestures in the public space. And so my focus was on certain media, the body as a medium, but also music, theater, material sort of culture, like objects, etc. So now, as my investigation progressed, I realized that was the wrong approach. And that, in fact, the idea of imitation, for example, extended way beyond cultural artifacts. People could say, and this was very relevant to the actual sort of people living in Chile at the time, people could say that someone was a bad example. And authorities made this claim constantly whenever judging people. For example, the courts, tribunals, kept sort of in late colonial and early sort of national period, they They kept arguing that some people were bad examples to others. And that's why they deserve some form of containment or punishment. And the argument was the same as the argument that they were using when talking about theater, is that people imitate each other. And so there's a power associated with some forms of behavior. For example, whenever a woman did not respect the rules of patriarchy or engage in what authorities consider promiscuous sort of behavior, they were considered a bad example. And they attributed to her the power to affect and transform others. So from her behavior, others would imitate. So in a certain way, it would be replicated across society, and they needed to stop that replication somehow. So I said to myself, all right, there is a wide set and range of actions and practices and experiences that actors are sort of framing in communicative terms, in terms that they're attributing power to what people do, as if they could somehow affect others through their gestures, through their actions, through the objects that they were, through the, it could be a portrait of the king or a national flag. And so they kept saying these are powerful and meaningful practices that have an effect on others. So I started, rather than focusing on specific media, I started focusing on those underlying principles that sustained claims to efficacy, to this kind of like efficacy or action on others. So for example, the connection between theater and the behavior of women considered to be promiscuous is imitation. So one of the chapters in this book is about imitation, the field of imitation as structuring a field of political action in a certain way. So I moved from specific artifacts to more general principles and to how the actors sort of debated over these principles. Now, at the same time, I knew that this was these questions were inseparable from politics. Whenever people, at first I thought that the reason why politics was ever present in the documentation that I was reading was precisely because this was a revolutionary era, and because of course actors will try to use the power of communication, however they might sort of perceive of it, to foster their own sort of interests or projects. But the relationship ran deeper. And what I argue in this book is that is that for actors in this era in Chile, of all walks of life, the main component of public life, the main component of politics really, is the ability to affect each other. What renders something public is defined by certain parameters of let's say action over others. And so what I focus is on those parameters that were essential for people to describe something as being public, of public relevance. So someone's behavior at home, again, for example, the example of a woman who might be considered promiscuous, becomes a public issue. And it becomes a public issue, not just, and this, the sources are very clear. It's not just because of like religious concerns. It's not just over, because they are being immoral, which is a problem, but that doesn't make it public. What makes it public and guarantees state intervention is the fact that these actions are contagious, that they replicate. So they are part of a larger sort of field of interactions that is held together by the power of imitation. So how can you fight the example of promiscuous women with virtuous women on stage, on theater plays? They all belong in the same social space in a certain way, right? So that was what I was getting at, that communication and politics at the time were very much intertwined and almost sometimes, I would argue, can be identified one with the other. Now, as I was doing this, I was also thinking about politics during the Age of Revolutions. And I was reading the amazing new scholarship that has been published over the last years, including Kirsten Schultz work on Brazil, including Sinclair Thomson's work on Andean insurgencies, but also Marcela Echeverry's work on Nueva Granada, Cristina Soriano on Venezuela, Laurent Dubois on the Caribbean, on the French Caribbean. What I was learning from that scholarship, so that scholarship, what it was doing, in my opinion, was sort of decolonizing our perspective, our vision of the Age of Revolutions, and offering a new perspective of the kinds of actors and questions that were essential to that era. And what the portrait, not the portrayal, but the way in which they portrayed the Age of Revolution, or kind of like the image of the Age of Revolution that emerged from that literature, at least to me, was one of increased contestation and multiple actors sort of vying for power and advancing their own sort of visions of alternative social order. The problem, quote unquote problem, to me was that that was not necessarily different from earlier decades. So if we really adopt a decolonial approach to the colonial era and colonial politics in Latin America and the Atlantic world more generally, I think we might conclude that some actors have been denied the label of revolutionaries simply because of their political project did not coincide with like those of like modern revolutions, such as the French, right? Or because they were peasants or indigenous or enslaved people, right? Enslaved Africans or people of African descent. So why not consider some forms of, some rebellions and revolts that predated the Age of Revolution as revolutionary too? And I think that the more we expand the sort of the catalog of political objectives that can be classified as being revolutionary during the Age of Revolution, for example, the assertion of indigenous sovereignty that Sinclair Thomson has studied, the more the boundaries between the Age of Revolution and previous decades become blurry. We find revolutionaries before the so-called Age of Revolutions. So what's special about the Age of Revolutions? What makes it different? Why keep calling it the Age of Revolutions? I propose to call it the Age of Dissent, but that's a provocation. I know I'm not going to change the way in which we, but that's what I think it makes the difference. It's the role of dissent in public life, the role of dissent in communication. Because I could see a difference when I observe communication, when I look at this field of like imitation, for example, I could see that there was an important difference between how that operated in practice during the late colonial era and what eventually emerged after this revolutionary process. Now, I don't set a specific date for the onset of the revolutionary process. I don't think we can say it was 1808 when the Spanish monarchs were imprisoned by Napoleon, or like actually they abdicated and well, anyway, there's a debate about how to exactly sort of describe that event, but I don't think that we need to come up with a specific sort of date, like marking a difference between the pre-revolutionary and the revolutionary. I see in Chile around 1780 a kind of like a revolutionary moment and a set of transformations that would become more accelerated as the Spanish Empire decomposed over the following decades. But what I could see is that in that process, politics had changed because of people's perception of communication, people's experience of politics, like how can they affect each other? People's idea of what can you do through imitation had changed. it was a different landscape. And so it's, in a certain way, what I argue in the book is that we cannot describe the Age of Revolution as an era of increased, let's say, political negativity. Understanding by political negativity some form of dissent, some vision of like, yes, power is being contested. People are negotiating the power structure. People are opposing, existing political structures. Because I think that eventually that claim can be challenged. And someone can say that was also the case in 1750 or in 1680 and all the time, people are always challenging. And so I thought it was not necessarily a very clear or very useful way of distinguishing this time. But so it's not negativity itself, it's the role of negativity in public life. So what changes is that at a certain moment, people start living in a world where there are plural and multiple forms of political of demonstration, for example, of loyalty. During late colonial era in Chile, people all had to proclaim, at least publicly, that they were loyal to the Spanish king. After or during the revolutionary process, what we find is that people have different sort of allegiances, and eventually they recognize that maybe not everyone's loyal to the government. Maybe it's all right to have people who have a different opinion, and I'll go back to that concept because it's essential to the argument I'm making. So maybe people have different opinions. And so there's a difference between having a world where everyone is supposed to agree on a basic set of like everyone supports the Spanish monarch, to a world where there are royalists and revolutionaries, and within the revolutionaries there are different factions. And even after the revolution, when there are no longer any royalists in the public sphere, you can see, for example, people using the symbols of national unity to express dissatisfaction and disunity towards the government. The best example I have of this, I think, is that people were required by law, as they are required today, I think in Chile, just today, with this is the national festivities today in Chile. So they're required by law to put a flag, a national flag, outside of their house. And so sometimes, as I did when I was young and in my house, like, you don't put the flag. It's a way of showing some form of like discontent. Well, people in 1829 did the same. They instead of showing up flags in Santiago de Chile to celebrate the national festivities, they kept them at home. And so conservatives, who were then at the opposition, said, you see, this is evidence that the government does not enjoy support of the population. That is extremely different in a certain way from the public life of the late colonial era, where these sort of political confrontations in the public sphere did not take the place of like a public display of rejection toward the regime, and played out in a different manner. So that's pretty much how I came to this project and came to elaborate the idea. My argument, therefore, is that what sets this moment apart is that the political sort of world that emerged from the activities of ordinary men and women in Chile between 1780 and 1833 was profaned and pluralistic, relatively pluralistic. And is that difference, the profanation of the public order and the incorporation of dissent as a inextricable dimension of public life, that set the Age of Dissent apart from other eras? This is the era where people for the first time experience constantly some sort of negativity in public life, some sort of dissent, some sort of, I'm not saying that there was no dissent before. What I'm saying is that the role it played in public life was very different. And the way in which it was incorporated and the kinds of things that you could do as a dissenter were very different between the colonial and the post-colonial era, if you want to put it that way, or the pre-revolutionary and the revolutionary era. Bear with me as I go through the concepts that I just mentioned, profaned and pluralistic, because I think they can be a bit perhaps new. I don't know how I'm in time, Sinclair. Is it, how much have I been talking? Do I still have?
You're okay.
All right. So I don't want to bore you, but my argument is, so here's the comparison I make between colonial politics and post-colonial politics, or colonial public sphere and the post-colonial public sphere. In the colonial public sphere, politics is organized around two principles: a transcendent source of authority and a set of and unity as a normative ideal. So the transcendent source of authority means just that human societies have a transcendent, an exterior point of reference. Most normally is just God. So God dictates the order of nature. God dictates, in this philosophy of politics that underlied, both discourses and practice at the time in the late colonial era. People just thought, or at least their arguments were based upon the assumption that there was some entity, some point of reference that was outside of society that dictated the way society should be. So, for example, people might say there's a natural order to human society, and someone's actions, for example, an enslaved woman wearing some kind of dress, a silk how do you say this when shawl? Is that the word? All right, a silk, yeah, or scarf, or like some satin shoes, right? Well, the reason why authorities sort of argued that they could sort of control that sort of behavior was that what they were doing, what enslaved people, for example, this also goes for free people of color, indigenous people, they were questioning a God-given order. And so society cannot give to itself its own social structure. So it's not that the social structure that they lived in, they didn't think, all right, this is our invention, it's just an agreement, it's a consensus that we have, we can change it, right? If there's another government, they might, change this. What they thought, what all of the actors constantly said in their sort of, in litigation, for example, was just simply, there's a God-given order, and we might disagree over what that God-given order is, but it is God-given. It comes from outside of society. So this sounds very abstract and philosophical, I know, but it's essential to understand colonial politics, because otherwise we lose the ability to understand the difference between the kind of regime that the colonial world was and the kind of regimes that emerged from it. Why are they different? Otherwise, we might end up arguing that nothing changed. It's the same landowning elite that continued in control of the government. It's the same world, nothing substantial change. And that, I think that argument emerges from or is reflective of a misunderstanding of what politics actually is about, and the political principles that governed both colonial and post-colonial, colonial and post-colonial world. So that's the principle of transcendence. And there was one mediator that everyone pretended to agree on that had a privileged access to that external point of reference. And that was the monarch. So this political system is organized around requesting the monarch to interpret the correct order of the world as it was dictated by an external order. So the monarch says, because we know that the order of the world is X, Y, and Z, I therefore conclude that, or decree, for example, that people of mixed race should not use this or that kind of cloth because it is a way of confusing the correct order of society, right? Or they could claim that this also extended to all kinds of interactions. People could claim to could ask the king to settle a dispute over someone not taking their hats off when seeing somebody else on the street, right? And so the person who expected the other to take their hat off, well, the other would feel offended and would go to court to demonstrate that he was of higher social standing than the other person. And the other person might argue, no, I'm actually the same social sort of position. So I'm not required to take my hat off. And both would be expecting from the king to tell what is exactly their social location, who's superior and who's inferior. And the king knows, because the king has a privileged position within this system, this privileged access to a transcendent source of order. And all right, so that's transcendence. And, and unity is just the idea that society in its perfect form should just be harmonious, that everyone should be united, and that for some reason, we humans are unable to recognize a God-given social order. But in principle, if we followed this external sort of point of reference, society should have no conflict. Everyone should just recognize their position, and all conflicts over like social structure emerge from an inability of humans to accept their position in this naturally given order of society. And so that is very different. And that expressed itself in the way in which the public sphere operated and what they could do in the public sphere. So, for example, as I said, is when it came to like these gestures on the public sphere, or the clothes that they were allowed to wear, that people were allowed to wear, or they chose to wear, these principles were always on the lurking on the back of their minds whenever they had to sort of defend their decision, or defend a certain sartorial choice, or justify why they felt offended by somebody else's position in a public ceremony, for example. That was also something that originated a lot of conflict in colonial times. It's like, who's closer to the governor, who's supposed to be to his right or to his left. And so in what I see in this era as happening is that people going to the public sphere and saying, you know what, no, I will wear some kind of clothes, for example, that reflect the social order that I think we should adopt. So, for example, there start appearing different sort of, there emerge different political factions, liberals and conservatives. Now, most of the scholarship thinks that these are just elite factions that have zero sort of connection with ordinary people, but I show in the book that that was not really the case, and that the emergence of these groups was pretty much tied to a new idea of the social order as something that you could actually have let's use a modern concept, you could have an opinion on. You could actually, wear a suit that represented your commitment with equality, while others, you would accuse them of wearing suits that were aristocratic, that were representative, that suggested a kind of like an allegiance with an older social order, right? Then in the colonial world, the objects representing political power were always a little bit, not always, but most of the time they were sort of difficult access. So a portrait of the king was something that some elite people had at their houses, but most of the time for most people would just be something that they wouldn't touch, that would be they would have a sort of deference. They are required to exhibit some form of deference towards the objects representing royal sovereignty. And as I show in the book, during the revolutionary era, what they do is precisely the opposite. They stone them. They stab portraits of the king. They take the royal coat of arms and drag it to the floor. They attack some other coat of arms with hammers and destroy pieces of it. They get there's a silver coat of arms that they that they melt to create like coins bearing, new revolutionary emblems. So I call that the profanation of politics. Sure. I was afraid that I wouldn't have enough to say for all this time, so I'm happy that it was not the case. And so that's profanation. And as for pluralism, what I see in the book, what I show is that, as I mentioned before, this is a world where people start sort of conceiving of ways in which they can think about their ability to affect each other, but at the same time respect that or accept the possibility that others might have a different political allegiance. So for example, they come up with the concept of opinion, as I said before, and they start using it constantly to say, well, an opinion is something that is non-public, perhaps, and it doesn't affect others. So maybe I can say that we can all coexist as long as we have just different opinions, and that's fine. Other people at the same time are saying, no, having an opinion is already a crime. If you have an opinion that goes against the government, that's already a crime. So as you can see there, they're thinking about and sort of elaborating concepts about their ability to affect each other, about communication. So my book is not, as I said before, an endorsement of the power of communication, but rather an exploration of how people are sort of struggle, if you want, to define how can we affect each other, how the power of communication is an object of contention, how they sort of negotiate different ways of describing what they do to each other. And it's also a way of transforming and shaping people's lives, not in the sense of like the conventional views of like communication affecting our worldview or of our experience of the world, etc., but rather as an expression of negativity that I find essential to the larger history of democratic regimes that are profaned and pluralistic, not only in Chile, but in the wider Latin America and the Atlantic world. So thanks for your patience, and I will give the floor to Kirsten.
All right. Well, I'm very happy to be here, very honored to be here to celebrate the publication of such a smart and engaging book as The Age of Dissent. So thank you, Martín, for writing it. Thank you, Sinclair, for the invitation. Thanks to the Abu Dhabi Institute for hosting us in this swank room. You're not hearing me? Okay, I'll get a little closer. So I want to start by just confessing a little bit. I like Sinclair, I learned a lot from this book, probably because I didn't know enough as I should about Chile and the era of independence. The book's pages include really sharp and concise accounts of the political turning points, the alliances, the conflicts that marked the turn of the 19th century in Chile. So I would say, if you don't know anything about Chilean independence, this is a great book to start with because it's so well written and so compelling. We do meet some of the traditional cast of characters, right? Rest assured, Ambrosio Higgins makes an appearance, and so does Bernardo. So there's that too. But he attends very carefully to the broader regional and transatlantic developments by looking so carefully and I think innovatively at their interactions with this local social political order and a politics that had a logic of their own. So in fact, for me, I think The Age of Dissent is a revelation precisely because it so compellingly examines how people from a range of social groups and with a range of political identities navigated the crises that beset the Spanish Empire, the Andes, and Chile at this turn of the 19th century. So Martín looks at this, how people from a range of social groups deal with this period of crisis And he shows how in doing so, they forge a new kind of politics. He excavates practices, gestures, dress, and other forms of material culture to analyze their meanings in relation to other more discursive political expressions. And he then, in this way, brings, I think, the Age of Dissent or an Age of Dissent into view as a moment when people reckoned with the crisis of empire and sovereignty by incorporating precisely contestation into this new and dynamic field of social and political action. So I'm going to say a little bit more about the political cultural transformations that his book outlines. I'll be treading some of the same territory that he did, less eloquently. Maybe I'll be able to contextualize it a little bit. The two things that I want to spend time on are his work on materiality and the status of the visible, and then this question of the profane and profanation. So to begin with materiality and importantly, visibility. So The Age of a Dissent is a book, as its subtitle indicates, that foregrounds and then, as Martín was explaining to us, critically examines communication as a social political practice. He explains that in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, change in politics and political culture were closely linked to conceptions of the power of communication. And especially as he was just talking about how he's able to sort of historicize how people understand the power of communication. Throughout the book, he critically engages with historical sociology to analyze the various expressions of the power of communication through the frameworks, as he's explained to us, of propagation, imitation, and contagion. And along the way, he also demarcates the very specific tensions that emerged around visibility and reminds us of how politics and political allegiances materialized in objects such as we were just talking about, the portrait of the king, the flag, and the rosette, right? And as I was thinking about this event, I thought, well, if we had a party favor for the book launch, it would be the rosette, right? We would all get little rosettes of one color or another. And that would tell us who we were, right? Where our allegiances lie. So we encounter these objects, however, in Martín's book in really careful reconstructions of their uses in the lived experiences of Chileans with diverse allegiances, interests, and vision for the future. And in the context of conflict, such objects were central to the visible, the sort of self-consciously visible exchange of information about these shifting allegiances, and to an emerging partisanship that was itself very self-consciously visible. The display of flags and rosettes and portraits could be an affront, of course, an act of defiance, or constitutive of a solidarity. As Martín also explains, and I think this is central to his broader analysis of political cultural transformation, quote, visible publicness became an arena of partisan disagreement, and open visible dissent became a part of political life. At the same time, what Martín calls, or his analysis of what he calls visible publicness, reframes and goes beyond older debates about the public sphere by positing visibility as what he describes as the sine qua non for the rule of law and the social order that the law purported to uphold. And here I'll quote him, by producing relations of visibility, he writes, cities could enforce lawful behavior, promote Catholicism, and ensure the correct functioning of society. Thus, and as people from various social groups recognized, public visibility contained both an emancipatory and a disciplinary potential. And as an example, Martín offers what I think is a really fresh and compelling reading of the practice and figure of the tapada, right? And for those of you who don't know, right, this is the practice of wearing a very large shawl so as to cover your face and head almost entirely. Although most observers of the tapada, the figure of the tapada, contemporaries and later, and especially the contemporaries that were men, fixated on women, it was a practice embraced by men as well. And as Martín explains, became a sign of the power that contemporaries recognized in the condition of the visible. Rather than simply expressing modesty, people who covered their faces in the streets or even at social events responded to what he characterizes as the imperatives of visibility. Quote, by covering their faces, He explains men and women suspended, at least partly, the idea of a discipline and the rule of law associated with visible publicness. They questioned the social and racial hierarchies that separated obscure from visible people. They navigated and even transgressed accepted gender norms, and they coped with the social demands associated with visibility. Martín also traces the nexus of visibility and the politics of representation in an age of dissent. Rather than simply making an ordained social order visible, in the midst of challenges to ideas about the social practices of nobility and racial difference, clothes and badges, as he was explaining earlier too, became objects that appeared capable of both deconstructing and reconstructing social relations and social difference. Clothes and badges could be deployed to serve social engineering projects with very diverse goals, including creating visible Europeanized hierarchies among the indigenous Mapuche, while also challenging racial and social hierarchies and other spaces within society. Signs of difference, he then explains, could, quote, express competing views about the origins and nature of social inequalities. From being a mirror, and these are Martín's words, from being a mirror of transcendent hierarchical differences, the realm of visible publicness became a stage in which actors disputed a mutable, openly contested social order. So there's this, I encourage you all to check this out, right? This very, very engaging discussion of the visible. As the book attends so carefully then to intersections of what he calls public visibleness and contestation, it also offers an analysis of how dissent reemerges, I would say, as an ideal and a practice within a broader set of enduring political cultural transformations. Across the book, Martín reminds us of the political theological foundations of sovereignty and authority within the Spanish monarchy, what concord, harmony, and unity meant for people living in the polity and social order that the kings of Spain sought to rule over, and of a sovereignty that materialized in the colonial era, as he was explaining, in reiterated royal and religious rights that affirmed the divine foundations and purpose of a unified common good. At the turn of the 19th century, and I would say especially after 1808, this order was contested in new ways. Radical challenges to the monarchy's sovereignty were informed, as he explains very carefully, by broader Atlantic revolutionary currents, but they also arose out of the Catholic monarchy's political theology to produce what Martín identifies as the profanation or a profanation of politics. We should think through some manifestations of dissent, therefore, as iconoclastic acts that desacralized or, as to quote Martín, that profaned the sacrality of political power. Right, he just gave us the image of the stabbing of the portrait. This analysis allows him to offer the insight that, of course, the antithesis of the sacred then is not the secular, but rather the profane. And in Chile, the process of profanation was marked by acts that effaced the transcendent and even pre-political status of the sacred, and that yielded a new political subjectivity that was irreverent towards tradition and authority. On the ground in Chile, people from a range of social groups continued to regard the social order as grounded in the divine or in nature, but they desecrated the position of the mediator between society and this transcendent source of order. This desecration or profanation entailed a kind of emotional regime change, as chains of affection were broken in such a way that they could not be repaired. The profanation of political authority in Chile, in other words, Martín argues, I think very persuasively, had enduring effects. And to quote him again, efforts to restore the colonial regime's sacrality all eventually failed. While the revolutionary process in Chile did not involve the physical execution of the monarch, it did manage to destroy the king's other body, the transcendent one materialized in royal coins and portraits. Profanation also produced new views of the social order as mutable. And I'll try to call attention to the fact that he so carefully weaves together and integrates various strands of analysis. So I've just talked about visibility, but of course, visibility and profanation are very closely linked, and he makes that very clear throughout. Politics could transform the social order and necessarily then encompass dissent, conflict, partisanship, and plurality. As Martín makes clear, in an earlier colonial era, people in Chile and across Spanish America too certainly criticized royal policies. They criticized the officials sent to govern them, and in some cases, they criticized the monarchy itself. And that is to say that unity and concord were definitely attacked, and that a challenge to royal authority could produce a rupture. Yet, he also points out that such attacks tended to leave in place unity and concord as ideals that form the parameters of legitimate political action. In contrast, in the first decades of the 19th century, politics were no longer constituted only in people challenging the ruler and the people who represented those rulers. Rather, people came to conceive of and to embrace a politics of conflict between different groups within society. As Martín observed, such political cultural transformations in Chile and Spanish America bore some of the marks of North Atlantic or Euro-Atlantic lineages of liberalism and of a liberal elite fear of dissent among the people, the poor, the enslaved, the formerly enslaved. Indeed, by the 1820s, debates about Chile's political future were part of an unfolding transatlantic constitutional revolution, and Chileans' engagement with what Martín describes as liberalism as a global political ideology was manifest. However, and I think this is a really important instigation to rethink independence era Latin America, Martín also shows that such a defense of dissent came out of Hispanic and Catholic and local renegotiations of public and private, of justice and the political itself. So this isn't a story, or it's not only a story of how people adopted abstract ideas of toleration. Instead, he traces a much more complex lineage of medieval and early modern Hispanic political theological ideas about dissent and its legitimacy, and how they could provide grounding for renegotiating politics during this time of crisis. And I'll quote Martín, rather than offering a linear history of political toleration being implemented in Chile due to new and progressive ideas imported from abroad, his exploration of the archive discloses a much more complex borrowing from different intellectual traditions. While here, I think that Martín's contribution lends itself to very productive dialogue with scholarship on the Catholic Enlightenment and Hispanic modernities, his analysis also urges us to reckon with the social dimensions and with how ideas of dissent were shaped by demands expressed on the ground in Chile among various social groups, as well as by the responses that those actions elicited, right? I cannot stress enough how grounded this is in local reality at the same time that it attends very carefully to transatlantic forces and ideas. Understanding public opinion, its emergence as a political idea in Chile, Martín shows requires attending to communication, to how communication came to be understood as an intersubjective phenomenon. That is, he explains how visible, once again, right, the status of the visible is very crucial, how visible forms of communication made public views and experiences that were previously understood to be interior, as well as how people from various social groups reevaluated the status of speech, of what it represented in the context of the polity. Widespread political contestation on the ground, he writes, quote, led actors to generate alternative ways of framing power and communication. People of various social classes came to accept antagonism and disunity as an inescapable political experience, one located at the crossroads of the public and the non-public. This was the new profane politics of the Age of Dissent. So I'll close, right, and I'm going to be brief because I know I'm sure lots of people have questions for Martín. I'll close by just calling attention to one further insight that I think he offers as he very eloquently contextualizes the book and this history of political cultural transformation that it tells in the concluding pages. As people in the late 18th century and early 19th century Chile reckoned with crisis, they did not, he observes, forge a linear path towards democratic government. And the history of constitutionalism, right? By the way, this book also includes a very good history of Chilean, good survey of Chilean constitutionalism that makes that very evident. We're not talking about a linear path. And yet, he concludes, we can't write a history of democracy in Chile without understanding what this period means. As people in Chile embraced indetermination and division as aspects of the social order and politics, they also, and I quote Martín once again, framed the ways in which they were capable of affecting one another, and thereby forged forms of life. I like that. I really like the way that you capture that, forms of life upon which modern democracies came to depend. So thank you very much for the book, Martín.